teachers that I follow, Andrew Holenchek says, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are, right? So we're always looking through things through the lens of our experiences, our conditioning. And so when we bring in the 5 aggregates, the skandhas, the heaps, our 5 layers of existence, this is what many teachers say sets you up for kind of, for lack of a better word, tougher discussions, right? Like I was talking about, like no self of, who really, am I? What is the nature of my being? And so I'm just going to talk about each of them, and feel free to, pop in with your comments. So the first one is form, right? Anything that's material, the physical realm. The Pali is rupa. It's direct experience through our senses. I like that one. I've heard different ways of doing it, but really to be able to see form and material, we do that through our senses. I don't know, is that controversial, Jonathan? Would you agree? So direct experience through our senses. And so when we're talking about a conditioning in relation to form, and I bring these up, none of this is judgment, right? This is to be curious and think beyond our conditioning. So I hope that you accept these questions with care and not personally. But an example of the conditioning is like, how important is your hair? Right? And attachment, the conditioning and attachment, right? I got my hair did today, right? And I think that, and Erica, you do hair, right? That's what you do for a living, right? So I feel like I'm really picking on her tonight, but that just came up. I'm like, hey, she does hair. But for some reason, I can't let go of that yet. I'm a lot grayer than I look, folks. And so there was a big line. I can bend down tonight on Zoom. If I would have done that yesterday, you might have had some judgment roll across your mind. But so when we're talking about conditioning and attachment and to just form this first aggregate, it could be hair, it could be fashion, right? It could be anything material. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. We have another. Yes, hair is important. Because what will people think of you? Well, in another year, I feel like 50 is like I have this conditioning in my head that after 50, you can do whatever you want, and you care less about that. So I just turned 49. So I'm thinking next year, I'm going to be wild. I'm just going to be wild. And you probably won't recognize me because I'll have white, crazy hair. Erica's saying, no, don't do it. The second one is feelings. So the second aggregate is feelings, sensations. It's our response to our experience with sensation. So it's when we say, ooh, I like that, I don't like that, or I don't have a feeling. And that's Vedana in Pali. The next one is perception. Remember, perception is creation, right? It's recognition of something, of a memory. It's an interpretation of sense objects followed by mental labeling. So if we eat something, maybe we say, ooh, that's salty, or that's sweet, or that's good, or that's bad. We don't like that. Sana is the Pali word for that. So perception is that mental labeling. I love this. One of my teachers said, we fall in love with our projections, our perceptions, and then we wonder why that love eventually fades. Right? So you think of those that have been in relationships for a really long time. You're like, it's just not that same person that I first met. Of course, we know, of course you're not, things change all the time. These are also things that we, like perceptions, or I see a wall because I have a construct of a wall. I have a concept of that. So that's a wall, and that's what a wall looks like, right? This is what a man looks like. This is what, the colors, all of that. I'm going to try this riddle out for you guys. I tried it on my husband to see, because I was like, So anyway, here's a riddle for you. There was a father and his son returning from an event, and they were in the car driving home, and they had to cross some railroad tracks. And the signal for the train, the arm was broken, and something happened, and there was a horrible accident. And the father died immediately. The son was injured. They were quickly able to, get him a rescue squad. He arrived at the hospital, and the surgeon met, the gurney and the medical and this young boy. And the surgeon said, "That's my son. How could that be?" How could that be? The riddle. It's a riddle. Yes. Yes, Drew. Yes. Did anyone else think that? Was this rigged? Right? So I guess this comes from like a book of riddles, but it points to one other way of our perceptions, right? Like, wait a minute, a surgeon can't be a woman, right? Or you just get caught up and, it's, even myself, I was like, wait a minute, I love riddles. Wait a minute. So just another example of perceptions. There's so many that we have all the time. The next one, the fourth one, is the mental formations. This is our volitional mental actions. It's usually triggered by an object or anything. It's kind of like a storyline. I've heard it described as that. Polyasanskaras. I think it's Chris Wallace, if you're familiar with him. He says you can't have a bad day without the help of your storylines. So I really like that. So, if we're not attaching ourselves to our own story and our past experiences, you can't have a bad day without the help of your storylines. My car, the tags expired in January, and my car yesterday happened to be the last one in the driveway, and my husband took it out and I hadn't put the tags on yet. And he came back and he's like, yeah, of course. He's like, didn't have the tags. There was a police officer following me. And he had this whole like storyline of like, it would happen, and just in preparing for this talk, I was like, wow, that's a storyline that caused suffering, that he didn't get pulled over, in, Midtown Omaha with his CRV, old CRV. He wasn't getting pulled over for the first day of tags. But that's an example of that anxiety, right, of being in the future. Being aware of mental formation means also being aware of your prejudices and your biases. And so it's one of the most important of the 5 aggregates. but it's also one of the most challenging to undertake, right? It's so really treating that with care, like, do I have, if you've been conditioned a certain way, it doesn't look like a prejudice or a bias. It's just what we know. We don't know any different. So it's really challenging to, and that's why our practice is so powerful. And that's why I'm so energized by it, because I really feel that not only is it, connecting me to the world as a whole and making me a better person. Um, I think that's also the ability for everyone else, right? If more people knew this, if more people were open. This Andrew Holenchek that I listened to, and I've shared with you guys his definition of meditation, which is habituation to openness, right? We are so constricted by who we think we are, who we're trying to maintain, this image that we're trying to reify. It's wearing us out, right? This is where it gets complicated, and you point to, this is not a realistic view. This is a form of ignorance, right? So it's hard. The last one is consciousness. I think of this a little bit in Pali, it's Vijnana. It's the storehouse of memory. It's all of our experience. The awareness of physical and mental processes. But when we have that awareness of our physical and mental processes, it allows for wisdom and the practice of insight. I think I said at the beginning that wisdom is what destroys ignorance. And that's why it's kind of later on. It's at the end of the Eightfold Path, because you got to play around and think about all these other things. And wisdom comes through, cultivation. In my view, and practice, once you're able to start bringing in that wisdom, or maybe seeing more clearly, the clarity of view, the realistic view, the wisdom destroys ignorance, but then the wisdom then has the space to create something, which is really exciting, and that could be, compassion or whatever, your worldview is. And when we look at ourselves and then we look at the world, and we look at all of us having our own 5 aggregates, that's a lot, right? All of our own experiences, and it's what makes us amazing. But just the world is basically an intersection of all those many minds and experiences, and it's pretty wild. So, wanting to talk just a little bit about paying attention to these aggregates and how we begin to work with them. Like, what do you do? Because, I've been in plenty of teacher meetings and Tuesday nights where we talk about, it's really hard to look at them individually, right? When we're talking about we smell something and then we have a reaction to something and then the storyline comes, in our meditation and mindfulness practice, we're able to slow down a little bit to see that, but some of those, they go hand in hand, at least in my experience. So before you know it, it's already happening. So this idea of the speed of our thoughts, right? So we can sit in meditation, and perhaps we have a different speed of thoughts, a different gait, right? We're calm. We've created an environment for it. But what happens when we're out in the real world, right? Like, do we have that same, are we able to slow down and see our thoughts, see our prejudice, our bias, or do we catch them after the fact, right? Or something that we're trying to change in our conditioning. We see something. So this, we see something oftentimes or someone, and based on our feelings and sensations, that dislike or like or whatever, we contract, right? We proliferate, the thoughts begin to proliferate. Mark talked about papancha, those, that thinking. So that begins, and then what happens? We react, right? Like, what's something, an example that's going on right now is vaccines, right? So we can't help but, if we pop into the news, right, there's talk about the vaccines and what a mess it is and all that stuff. And we can't help, in my opinion, to bring it to us. Like, well, what's in it for me? Where do I fit into this? In this example, where do I fit into the vaccine plan? What's going to happen to me? Am I going to be okay? And so, this is just one example of just the many things, that all the information that we're continually being inundated with, and how we respond to that. It's moment to moment experiences and the mental projections we just add on top of those experiences. And that's the difference, is being able to separate those. So, any thoughts on anything? What's this rigged? Still makes me laugh. Yes, with more and more practice, it definitely comes to light faster in some instances. And in others, there's still more practice needed. Yeah. And I think in relationship to others, right? We start with ourself, what is there, even going back to those agreements, was there any resistance, when I called out the fact that, there's more white males in here, what was your internal, response to that? And not needed, but like, those are the types of questions that I think really facilitate growth in the area of our conditioning. And that's just one example. I'm picking on the majority, right? So reflecting and thinking of our practice in all situations, right? And noticing, is there any resistance? Because if we're focusing on developing that openness, habituation to openness, that should cover that resistance of our conditioning, right? Hopefully, thinking of it in that way, noticing, and we do that. And I talked about that before, you can go throughout the day, and I've done this as a practice of seeing what I contract, what makes me hesitate, Are they words that somebody says? Is it something on TV? Is it the way someone is driving? Is it, I only really go to the grocery store, but my experience is there is somebody doing something that, I'm not open to. So I don't know who said it, but somebody said meditation is like detox. I kind of like that, right? It's clearing, and we've heard that before. It's really, it's kind of not erasing the mind, but clearing the canvas allowing, and that goes back to, wisdom destroying our ignorance, right? And if we go with that thing of canvas, which just popped in my head, then we can create something else, right, on that canvas. Another practice that was shared with me that I find um, has been beneficial for me is taking complaining. When we're talking about creating openness to everything, take complaining. Anytime that you feel that you're going to complain about something, or you can do this when someone, because I happen to live with someone that um, tends to highlight things that they don't like. But pausing, and I pause because then I don't like that. I constrict because there's not liking something, it's like this chain, but I watch that. So you can do it like, when you find yourself complaining, or someone else that you're close with, pause and then ask yourself, what am I feeling right now that I don't want to feel? Okay. This is an insight practice that, number one, slows you down and quiets you, right? Then what happens is you feel it, you don't feed into it. Because that's what we do. When we constrict, when we resist, contract is what I meant to say, it's that, and so we don't want to feel that maybe we're not heard, that, this is the way things are going to be, whatever it is. And that's what we feed, right? We feed those 5 aggregates. We're disliking something. And then we go straight to all the memories of perception, our storylines, the whole conscious of our memory. And that's what is suffering, right? So I've found that really helpful. I love that I found it today in some of my notes, because, we do things and then we forget about them. But it's a really good tool to ask yourself, what don't I want to feel right now? Creating that habituation to openness, feeling it, not feeding it. So ways that we can cultivate this wisdom and look at our conditioning, and maybe I'll look and see if there's anything going on. Okay. Anybody have any thoughts? We'll open it up just to maybe some discussion. But ways that we can do this is slowing down, right? So just being aware of that. Easier said than done, but more so in our daily practice. Watching us walk, opening the doors, whatever we're doing, being mindful. Telling yourself that you're okay. Hey, if this sounds goofy, what's your resistance to that? Because I guarantee you at some point in the day, you're not okay. And that's leading to papancha and your idea of self, and your conditioning. So if there's resistance, I just ask you to, ask why, and be open to telling yourself you're okay. Feel, don't feed, pause, right? And then there's always all sorts of shamatha, calming meditations, loving kindness, compassion, right? Developing, I love the 4 Brahma Viharas, because, they're from our heart, our second mind, our one mind, our chitta, and they really develop this kindness and compassion and openness that we're talking about, first with ourselves, and then we begin to see that in others. So those are also good practices. I guess I would say, this really opens the door to, there is no self in any of these five aggregates, right? There's no self in material form that we identify with. There's no self in sensations or emotions. We know that. We all feel them. They're passing. We aren't sadness. We experience sadness. There's no self in that. There's no self in our perceptions. There's no self in our mental formations. No self in consciousness, right? It's a little harder, we're hopping over the fence. So really beginning to, if you're at that point in your practice or even beyond, right? So revisiting it. But there's a lot of work, in my opinion, to do with those, right? And to keep them in the forefront of my practice, especially when my selfing really gets in the way, right? It's liberating, they say, and I've experienced it with some success. It's just not in all situations, right? So it's truly liberating once we begin not to depend upon the self. So yeah, with this, I open it up to any questions or comments.